Go ahead and get welfare, you poor thing. Those were the last words they threw at me before leaving. As they walked away, it felt like the weight of the world had collapsed onto my shoulders. I couldn't shake Greg's earlier statement. Even though you've always been independent, I felt like my pride as a man was wounded. From now on, I'm going to build a family with Brandy. Let's get a divorce. I signed the divorce papers, formalizing the end of our 18-year marriage. But as the shock wore off, I decided to pursue the division of our property. During a meeting with a lawyer, my sister, Brandy, had the audacity to demand her share of our assets. However, the lawyer's response caught us all by surprise. He burst into laughter before saying, "Aren't you the one living off welfare?" Brandy's face went pale, and she let out a horrified scream when the lawyer placed a stack of documents in front of her. "I'm Erin Anderson, I'm 45, and my now ex-husband Greg is 42. We were married for nearly 2 decades and have a 17-year-old daughter, Jenny, who's in high school. Greg and I met through work at related companies. At first, I saw him as a younger brother figure, but as time went on, our bond deepened. We eventually had Jenny, thinking we'd enjoy a peaceful life together once she grew up. But everything changed the day my sister, Brandy, appeared unannounced, suitcase in hand. Unlike my brother, I've never been able to get along with Brandy. She constantly undermined me, taking my belongings, my friends, and even my boyfriends. I'd moved to New York, earned my real estate license, and built a life of my own, hoping to keep her at a distance. Greg and I even opted for a private wedding to avoid her inevitable drama. But somehow, Brandy always found her way back into my life, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. "Wow, Erin, this is a nice house. Did you buy it yourself?" Brandy's voice cut through my thoughts as she wandered through our home. She didn't wait for a response. "I'll be staying in this room. It's perfect." I protested, but it was pointless. Today was a holiday, so Jenny was at school, and Greg was still at work. "Please leave before they get home," I begged, knowing my words would fall on deaf ears. That evening, Greg and Jenny returned to the house to find Brandy there, lounging like she owned the place. Who's this?" Greg asked, confusion written all over his face. Brandy flashed her practiced smile. "I'm Erin's sister, Brandy. I found your wedding photos at Mom's house and thought I'd drop by." Greg, knowing my complicated relationship with Brandy, looked uncertain, but soon enough, she spun a sob story about losing her job and needing a place to stay. Despite my protests, Greg and Jenny's sympathy won out. "Well, if it's just for a little while, I guess it's okay," Greg reluctantly agreed. And just like that, my sister wormed her way into our daily lives. She refused to help out around the house and even started taking money from my wallet without permission. I confronted her. "If you need something, at least ask before taking my money," I demanded. But Brandy only sneered. "Why should I? It's mine now." I held on to hope that she'd find a job and leave, but she never even bothered looking. Meanwhile, Greg's overtime hours at work didn't seem to reflect in his paycheck, and I began to suspect something was off. I asked him about it. "Your salary doesn't include overtime, right? Should I speak to HR about getting you the right pay?" I tried to keep my voice calm. Greg's response was sharp. "Out of character. I'm paid for my overtime. There's nothing wrong with my salary." The sudden defensiveness in his voice unsettled me, making me question everything. My sister was draining our resources, and Greg was growing distant. As my concerns mounted, I even spoke to my parents, who felt guilty for unintentionally revealing our marriage to Brandy. Despite the distance I had put between us, she had still found a way to invade my life once again. She must have planned this the moment she saw our wedding photos, I muttered to myself, realizing she had no intention of leaving. A darker thought crossed my mind. What if Brandy hadn't been fired at all? What if she'd quit just to freeload off us? If that was the case, I needed to act quickly before she tore my life apart once again. "You said you were fired, but wouldn't you be eligible for unemployment benefits if you were enrolled in employment insurance?" I confronted her one day, trying to make sense of her story. "I've always worked part-time, so I wasn't enrolled in anything like that. That's why I'm in trouble," Brandy shot back, her voice defensive as she shifted the blame onto me. Her twisted logic left me speechless, and suddenly everything clicked. Her never-ending job search had always been a sham. 3 months into her stay, my worst fears were confirmed. I discovered Greg and Brandy were having an affair. A cancelled meeting led me to a cafe where I saw them together, holding hands, laughing, completely oblivious to the world around them. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. It's unthinkable, a brother-in-law and sister-in-law acting like that. I confronted them both later that night, my voice trembling with anger. "So, all that overtime was a lie? Pretending to job hunt while spending your days with Greg? At your age, you still have to take something from me?" I exploded, barely able to contain my fury. They didn't deny it. Greg, shockingly casual, added insult to injury. If I had known how beautiful your sister was, I wouldn't have stayed away just because you told me to. His words cut deep, but it was what he said next that shattered everything. I've always felt like my pride was wounded. From now on, I want to build a family with Brandy. Let's get a divorce. He slid the already prepared divorce papers across the table, his name signed. There was no going back. Fine, we're done. There's nothing left to rebuild, I replied, my voice breaking under the weight of betrayal. Then Brandy, not missing a beat, sneered at me. Go ahead and get welfare, you poor thing, she mocked, her words drenched in contempt. Greg added coldly, since custody usually goes to the mother, Jenny should stay with you, do whatever you want from now on. With that, they left. Minutes later, Jenny walked in, confused by the heavy silence. Breaking the news of the divorce to her was harder than anything I had ever done. Shocked at first, Jenny soon seemed to accept it, perhaps with even a hint of relief. The divorce went through, but I wasn't done. I hired a lawyer and arranged a meeting with Greg and Brandy to discuss the division of our assets. Brandy, shameless as ever, demanded a share of what Greg and I had built over the years. What happened next was pure satisfaction. The lawyer, unable to suppress a laugh, replied, "Aren't you the one who should be on welfare?" The look on Brandy's face was priceless, her bravado melted into disbelief. She screamed when she saw the documents the lawyer handed her, her face drained of all color. The reality is, this couple doesn't have much money left to divide, the lawyer said, bluntly delivering the news. Brandy turned to Greg, her shock evident. Greg, too, seemed stunned by the revelation, but I had anticipated this moment and made preparations. As it turned out, the only remaining assets amounted to a mere $112,000, not the kind of wealth they had expected. What happened to your savings, Greg? You had a substantial amount, I pressed, my anger flaring as I watched him squirm. You really never cared about Jenny, did you? We agreed to save for her education, I reminded him, my frustration bubbling over. I transferred most of our savings to Jenny's account as we had discussed. Greg paled, remembering our conversation about the money. So, what's left in the $112,000? He asked, his voice shaky. About 80% of it is your secret stash, I answered calmly, locking eyes with him. You knew, and yet you agreed to transfer most of the savings to Jenny, knowing full well this day was coming. You even signed the consent form, I said. Greg's face twisted in frustration as he realized the gravity of his actions. It felt strange when you asked me for that consent, Greg muttered, scratching his head, clearly regretting his ignorance. But it was too late. His signature made the transfer legally binding. The lawyer confirmed that the money now in Jenny's account was off limits. It was no longer considered marital property. I had ensured Greg and Brandy wouldn't touch a penny of it. Brandy, realizing what had happened, turned on Greg, her voice filled with venom. You said we had plenty of savings. You promised we'd live luxuriously together, but now, there's barely anything. Why didn't you see Aaron's plan? Greg avoided her gaze, too ashamed to answer. Throughout our marriage, Greg had contributed very little financially. He carried student loans, and I had supported the household. We had agreed early on that I would manage living expenses while he focused on saving for our future. Yet, after all these years, Greg's savings amounted to barely $10,000, far less than the $100,000 he led me to believe. As I sat there, watching Brandy's shock turn into rage, I realized something. I no longer cared. The money, the betrayal, it was all behind me now. I had done everything to secure Jenny's future, and that was all that mattered. Brandy, unsure of what to do next, trembled with frustration, realizing her dreams of a luxurious life had evaporated. All that was left for them was $112,000, and the consequences of their actions. I decided it was time to reveal another truth. Looking directly at Greg, I spoke hesitantly, unsure whether to mention it but knowing it had to be said. Greg, aren't you planning to quit your job? His reaction was immediate. He looked visibly shaken. How do you know? He stammered, glancing around nervously. I started to suspect when I noticed your lack of overtime pay and a strange section on your payroll slip. It also didn't escape me that you've been using a large chunk of paid leave all at once, which is unusual for you. You've never taken more than the bare minimum of time off. That's usually a sign of someone preparing to resign. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I had suspected for some time that Greg planned to quit his job, hoping to walk away with a nice severance payout after the divorce. I asked pointedly, is that what you're doing? Greg's face flushed with guilt, confirming my suspicions perfectly. I couldn't help but smirk. Well, you were my husband. You should at least know what kind of job I have and how much wealth I've accumulated. To think you'd rely on that while cheating on me, and even planning to resign? You really haven't thought this through. Greg's face turned red, and the lawyer's earlier remark about welfare hit a nerve. If two unemployed individuals come together, they end up on welfare, the lawyer quipped. adding salt to the wound. Brandy, realizing the precarious situation, suddenly shouted, "Wait a minute, if you can cover Jenny's college expenses and our living costs, you must be hiding something. Come on, confess, you're hiding assets, aren't you?" Greg, emboldened by Brandy's outburst, chimed in, "That's right, Brandy actually owns real estate. We should be dividing those assets too." I almost got tricked. The absurdity of their claims left me speechless, but the lawyer couldn't help but chuckle, clearing his throat. He began to speak plainly. "Greg, as Erin's ex-husband, you should know that Erin owns real estate through her company, not personally. A corporation and an individual are separate legal entities. Erin's company assets are not marital property and cannot be divided." Realizing the mistake, both Greg and Brandy turned pale. The lawyer continued, "What we can divide are personal assets like cars, houses, and cash. And since Greg and Brandy have practically admitted to their affair, Erin has every right to demand compensation from both of you." Their faces contorted in disbelief. "Isn't that too much? It was just a few months," they protested. I cut in, "Who decided that the affair only counts for a few months? Greg, you took time off work to secretly date my sister, and Brandy didn't even bother to properly job hunt, choosing instead to live off my money." Remaining professional, the lawyer set the compensation amount at $10,000 from Greg and $3,000 from Brandy. Shocked, they hastily agreed, desperate to get the conversation over with, but the matter wasn't settled in a day. 2 weeks later, we reconvened. Brandy, now more defiant, demanded, "Give me the house and the car, then Greg can get his $122,000, and I'll pay the remaining $1,000. How's that for property division?" Her demands were so absurd that I nearly laughed, but I kept my composure. The house still has a mortgage and needs upkeep to retain value if sold. The car is only 5 years old and in great condition. Giving those to you would be a loss for me. Sister, did you even do the math? If you were selling the house and the car, you wouldn't be making such ridiculous demands. You're the cheating party here, and you have no right to make these claims. Turning to Greg, I added, "The house is under my name. I bought it before we got married, so no matter how you spin it, it's mine. As for the car, if you want it, you'll have to pay me half its appraised value. That's how property division works." Greg finally showed a sliver of thoughtfulness, pleading, "Can't you just give us enough money to start over, please?" His apology was shallow. He just wanted to avoid more trouble. "Your apology means nothing," I said coldly, "and given your attitude, it seems you don't want to pay child support for Jenny either. Why should I worry about your living expenses?" Realizing they couldn't sway me, they reluctantly signed the papers. Weeks after the settlement, Brandy called me again, her voice laced with frustration. "Why does Greg have so much debt? Weren't you covering the living expenses? What's going on?" I explained patiently what should have been obvious. Greg had barely saved anything despite our years together. He had less than $10,000 saved. He probably bought things on credit without you knowing. Brandy, eager to vent, continued, "Yes, he took out loans to buy brand name items, and his credit card was on revolving payments. It's a mess. How did he push this debt onto me?" "You're the one who stole him, remember?" I replied with a half laugh. Brandy fell silent. It seemed Greg had been hiding debts I didn't even know about. Now, they were her problem, and I couldn't help but feel a bitter sense of justice in that. "Oh, and there's something else I haven't told you, Brandy," I said, noticing her growing unease. "Greg mentioned he's working in construction now, as a sole proprietor. While that means his income and residence taxes are deducted, he's responsible for managing his own payments, like health insurance and the national pension. Being self-employed myself, I've always taken care of my national pension and health insurance, and I did the same for Jenny when Greg left his job in real estate, but it turns out Greg hasn't been paying his national pension for a year since switching jobs." Brandy listened, her expression tight with frustration. I continued, "I was covering the health insurance, so we had no issues there, but a national pension demand notice arrived at our house. I contacted Greg to ask if I could open it, and it was exactly what I suspected, a demand notice he'd been hiding. I had assumed he was taking care of it, just like I was handling my own, but no, when I called him about it, he nearly broke down, begging for help. National pension costs that much? You're kidding, right? I can't pay this. We were a family, weren't we? Can't you do something, please?" Greg had pleaded, his voice dripping with desperation. "The nerve of him to say that," I shot back, "the same man who abandoned his wife and child asking me for help." My words silenced him, leaving him with nothing to say. Over the phone, Brandy, too, seemed to lose hope as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "You'll have to figure it out yourselves," I said, calmly ending the call. Later, Greg called again, this time complaining about the high taxes on the car I had kept after the divorce. "Maintaining a car costs this much?" he whined. "The taxes are in the hundreds, And the vehicle inspection is so expensive. Isn't it tough? I responded dryly. No, I'm not taking the car back, I added before hanging up. After that, he started sending emails, pleading for help. But after I warned him that I would report his messages as harassment, he stopped altogether. Their divorce turned into a circus of petty arguments, dragging on for months. In the end, Greg declared bankruptcy. Luckily for me, I had already secured my compensation. Jobless, penniless, and now homeless, Greg refused to apply for welfare out of sheer pride. As for Brandy, the fallout from her selfish choices caught up with her quickly. After stealing her sister's husband and divorcing within 3 months, she was shunned by friends, family, and relatives. Her attitude and refusal to take responsibility made job hunting impossible. Whenever she did find part-time work, her domineering personality got her fired almost immediately. The lawyer's warning about welfare had become their reality. Brandy, still clinging to her remaining possessions, was ineligible for aid. After being evicted from her apartment, she, too, ended up homeless, just like Greg. Their actions, which had trampled on my and Jenny's lives, had brought them to this inevitable outcome. It was only natural, I reflected. Now, it's just me and Jenny, and our lives have returned to a peaceful normalcy. Jenny, relieved after Greg, who never supported her but always criticized her studies and ambitions, was finally gone, flourished. She passed her entrance exams and is heading to an Ivy League university this fall. As I watch her prepare for this new chapter, I'm filled with pride and a renewed sense of purpose. At 46, busy with work and still in good health, I feel more motivated than ever to keep moving forward.